The Wild West had stricter gun laws than America today. You ride into town after 3 months on the trail, dust in your teeth, a revolver on your hip, and the first thing the law does is take your gun, hands you a little numbered token for it, like a coat check. That is not a scene from a movie. That was the actual rule in Dodge City and in Tombstone, two of the wildest towns in the American West. The real frontier had tougher gun laws than most of America has right now, and the most famous gunfight in history broke out because a handful of men refused to obey one of them. If that flips what you thought you knew, subscribe and like. This is the West your history class got backwards. Here is the whole thing in 2 breaths. The Wild West everyone pictures, the armed free-for-all where every man wore a 6-shooter and settled arguments in the street, mostly did not exist the way the movie sold it. The busiest, roughest cattle and mining towns ran strict gun control, and they made you hand your weapons over at the edge of town. And the single most famous gunfight in American history, the one near the Corral, happened precisely because a few men would not obey that gun law. Picture how it actually worked. A cowboy comes off the trail in 1879, maybe 90 days out of Texas, 1,000 miles of dust behind him, his whole season's pay finally in his pocket. He rides into a town like Dodge City, Kansas, and before he can do much of anything, the rule meets him at the line. You do not carry that revolver here. He stops at a livery stable or a saloon, and he checks his gun the same way you would check a coat. The man behind the counter hands him a numbered token. The gun goes on a rack or in a drawer. The cowboy keeps the token, and when he is ready to leave, he trades it back and gets his weapon at the boundary, on his way out of town. That was not one eccentric sheriff's idea. It was written law. Dodge City passed its first ordinance banning the carrying of guns in town in 1878. There is a famous photograph of the wooden sign that stood on the main street. The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited. And in Dodge, the line was literal. The railroad tracks split the town in 2, and locals had an understood boundary they called the deadline. North of the tracks, the respectable side, the side with the businesses and the law, you did not carry a gun. Cross that line armed and you were breaking the ordinance. Down in the Arizona Territory, the silver boomtown of Tombstone went further. In 1881, the town passed Ordinance Number 9, and its plain purpose was written right into the title, to provide against the carrying of deadly weapons inside the city limits. You wanted to drink, gamble, and spend in Tombstone. You did it unarmed. So hold those 2 facts together, because the rest of this story lives in the gap between them. The wildest towns in the West disarmed you at the door, and on one cold afternoon in Tombstone, the men who refused to be disarmed walked straight into the men whose job was to enforce the law. That is where the legend was actually born. Start with the money, because money is the reason any of this existed. A cattle town was not a charity and it was not a church. It was a business, and its single biggest customer was the cowboy. Every summer the herds came north up the trails from Texas. And behind them came the men who had pushed them. Dozens of young hands paid off all at once at the end of a drive. A trail cowboy earned something like $1 a day on the drive. Call it $30 a month, and after 3 or 4 months of eating dust and sleeping on the ground, he hit town with real cash and a powerful need to spend it. The saloons, the gambling halls, the hotels, the stores, the stables, all of it lived on that money. Now look at the problem from the other side of the counter. You are a merchant in Dodge City. You need that cowboy's wages. But the cowboy walking into your town is exhausted. He is about to start drinking, and he is wearing a loaded revolver. Multiply him by 50. A single stray shot in a crowded saloon, one drunk argument that ends in gunfire, and you have a dead customer, a shattered window, a scared family that will never walk down your street again, and a newspaper story telling every cattle buyer in the country that your town is too dangerous to do business in. Violence was not just a tragedy, it was bad for trade. So the towns did the rational thing. They separated the men from their guns at the moment of highest risk, the moment of arrival, and gave them back at the moment of lowest risk, departure. It was crowd control dressed up as a town ordinance, and the goal was not some noble dream of peace. The goal was a working business district where people felt safe enough to spend. If that sounds strange for the frontier, it should sound familiar today. Walk into a stadium, a courthouse, a concert, a nightclub, and somebody at the door is checking you for weapons before they will take your money. The logic is identical. A venue that wants a crowd cannot afford an armed crowd. Dodge City and Tombstone understood that 140 years before the metal detector, and the system mostly held. Most cowboys grumbled and complied because the alternative was a fine or a night in jail and no fun at all. But a system is only as strong as its weakest night. So here is the question that hangs over the whole frontier. What happens when the men who refuse to give up their guns finally meet the men whose entire job is to take them? By the autumn of 1881, Tombstone was one of the richest silver towns in the country, and it was a powder keg. On one side stood the town authorities, the businessmen and the lawmen who answered to them. The town marshal was Virgil Earp, and he had deputized his brothers Morgan Earp and Wyatt Earp, along with a tubercular gambler and dentist named John Henry Holliday. The man history remembers as Doc Holliday. On the other side stood a loose faction of ranchers and rustlers that the town simply called the Cowboys, and among them were two pairs of brothers, Ike and Billy Clanton, and Frank and Tom McLaury. The bad blood between these men ran deep, and it ran for months. There were threats, stolen stock, a robbery, arrests, insults traded in the street. But strip away the feud for a moment and look at what the law actually had on its side that day, because this is the part the legend buries. The Earps were not avenging angels riding in for a duel. They were town officers, and they had an ordinance to enforce. Ordinance Number 9, no deadly weapons inside the city limits. On the morning of October 26, 1881, word reached Virgil Earp that the Clantons and McLaurys were in town, armed and making threats. Ike Clanton had spent the night drinking and telling anyone who would listen exactly what he was going to do to the Earps. Virgil, as marshal, had already pistol-whipped Ike and hauled him in front of a judge that morning for carrying a gun in town, and the fine was paid. But by the afternoon, the McLaurys and Billy Clanton were gathered in a narrow, vacant lot off Fremont Street, near a photographer's studio, just west of the rear entrance to the OK Corral, and they were still wearing their guns. So Virgil Earp made a decision that was, on paper, almost boring. He decided to go disarm them. He took his three companions and walked down to enforce the law. The whole confrontation was a police action. Hand over your weapons. You are inside the city limits. What happened next took about 30 seconds. Not a high noon. Not two men pacing off 100 feet apart in an empty street while a clock ticked. That image is pure Hollywood. The reality was a cluster of 8 men crowded into a lot maybe 20 feet wide. Close enough to touch. Virgil Earp called for the Cowboys to throw up their hands and give up their arms. There was shouting. And then, in a space tighter than most living rooms, roughly 30 shots were fired in half a minute. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead or dying: Billy Clanton, Frank McLaury, Tom McLaury. Ike Clanton, the man who had done the most talking, had run unarmed from the fight and survived. On the law's side, Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc Holliday was grazed. And Wyatt Earp walked away without a scratch. The most famous gunfight in the history of the American West was over before a man could finish a slow count to 30. And here is the thing the movies almost never tell you. It did not even happen at the OK Corral. It happened in a vacant lot down the block. The Corral just had the better name. Now, was it clean? No, people argued then, and historians still argue now, over who drew first, over whether the McLaurys and Billy Clanton were truly reaching for their guns or trying to surrender, over whether the Earps were enforcing the law or settling a grudge from behind a badge. A local court held a hearing that ran for weeks and ultimately did not charge the Earps, ruling they had acted within their authority as officers. The deeper truth is probably both things at once. It was a personal feud, and it was a gun law enforcement, and the two had become impossible to pull apart. But the frame the legend handed you is upside down. We remember the gunfight near the OK Corral as the perfect symbol of a lawless, anything-goes frontier where men shot it out in the street. Look again. It was a fight that started because the law told 4 men to take off their guns inside the city limits, and they said no. The single most famous shootout in American history is, when you read the records, the best proof we have that the Old West had gun control at all. And Tombstone and Dodge City were not strange exceptions. The same logic showed up across the cattle frontier. Abilene, Wichita, Ellsworth, Caldwell. The big Kansas cattle towns all passed ordinances against carrying guns once the herds and the money started arriving. Some of the cattlemen's associations and trail bosses went a step further and forbade their own cowboys from wearing 6-shooters on the drive at all, because a loaded gun on a tired man near a nervous herd was a danger to the whole outfit, not a comfort. Out on the trail and inside the town, the gun was treated less like a sacred right and more like a tool that had a time and a place. And the place was usually not your hip in a crowd. This collides head-on with the picture most of us carry. the picture of a frontier where every man walked around armed every single day and bodies piled up on Main Street by the dozen. So what do the actual records say? They say the violence was real, but it was nothing like the legend, and it was strangely concentrated. One careful study of the 5 major Kansas cattle towns across about 15 years, from 1870 to 1885, counted roughly 45 killings in total, not per year, total across 5 towns, across a decade and a half. In the worst single year in the worst town, the body count reached 5. 5 killings was a catastrophe that made headlines, not an average Tuesday. Dodge City, the so-called wickedest town in the West, the queen of the cowtowns, saw whole years with a single homicide, or none at all. Where the killing really clustered was not the cattle towns at all. It was certain mining camps in certain years, raw places packed with young single men, alcohol, gambling, and no families to settle them down. Boomtowns like Bodie, California, in its peak years could be genuinely deadly. But even there the violence fell hardest on a narrow slice of the population, the armed young men looking for trouble in the saloons, and it rarely touched the women, the children, the merchants, and the families. The frontier was dangerous in specific places, at specific times, for specific people. It was not a continent-wide bloodbath. So if the real West disarmed its visitors and counted its killings in the single digits, where did the other West come from? The one with the constant duels and the gun on every hip. It was built on purpose, and it was built to sell. It started while the frontier was still open. Dime novels turned working lawmen and petty rustlers into mythic gunslingers for readers back east. Then Buffalo Bill Cody put the West on a stage and toured it around the world as a thrilling show of cowboys and shooting. By the time Hollywood arrived, the formula was set. And in 1931, a writer named Stuart Lake published a biography of the aging Wyatt Earp that turned a flawed, complicated lawman into a clean American legend, and that book became the template for decades of movies. The High Noon Duel, The Fastest Gun, the lawless town tamed by one man with a 6-shooter, almost none of it matched the dusty, bureaucratic, money-driven reality. But the myth was a far better product than the truth. It sold books, it sold tickets, and it has been selling ever since. The men who built that myth were not historians, they were entertainers, and later they were people with a point to make. The image of an armed and lawless frontier, where everyone carried and the gun alone kept the peace, is a very useful story if you want to argue about guns today. The trouble is that the actual frontier keeps undercutting it. The real Dodge City would have taken your weapon at the door. So put the real West back together, the one the records actually describe. A cowboy rides in off the trail with 3 months of pay and a gun on his hip. The law meets him at the edge of town and takes the gun, and hands him a token for it, because the town needs his money but cannot afford his bullets. The biggest, wildest cattle and mining towns in the country run written ordinances against carrying weapons, ordinances stricter than what large parts of America live under today. And the most famous gunfight in the nation's history breaks out not because the West was lawless, but because 4 men broke a gun law and the officers came to enforce it. The armed and lawless frontier, the one where every man settled his own scores with a 6-shooter and no badge could stop him, was never the real thing. It was a marketing image, stitched together from dime novels and stage shows and movie scripts, and sold back to us until we mistook it for history. The truth is quieter and stranger and a lot more familiar. The Old West did not trust a crowd of armed, drunk, exhausted men any more than we do. It just did something about it. It disarmed them at the door and gave them a numbered ticket for the privilege. So the next time someone tells you the frontier was a place with no gun laws, where a man's revolver was his only law, remember the cowboy at the livery stable in Dodge City, trading his pistol for a token before he was allowed to spend a single dime. The Wild West was not the place without gun control. In a lot of ways, it was the place that invented it.